All right, I've told you about stone tools that were 10,000 years old, 8,500 years old, and now I'm going to talk about another occupation, another component, family campsite, that's about 7,000 years old. And it's characterized by a very different kind of projectile point. We call these barbed projectile points. It has a barb on both sides, and just to compare it with the one we saw earlier, here's the Angostura point, 10,000 years old. It's thrown, it's part of a dart, but it has a completely different technology. And this tool, when it enters an animal, is easily pulled out. And so sometimes these are considered to be thrusting spears, where they may not have been thrown through the air, they were just thrusted onto the animal. Barbed ones, like this, are clearly thrown with a spear thrower, and it has a small shaft, probably about as big around as my finger, attached here, and it was secured only by wrapping this narrow neck. The barbs on both sides stuck out on the edge of the shaft. So once this entered an animal, it could not be pulled out. And in fact, the wider the point is, the more damage it does as it's going through the flesh. So part of the idea here was when we see projectile points that have barbs on them, we readily associate with hunting. And they're often not used for anything other than projectile points. But I say that's their primary purpose. But most projectiles were on a foreshaft. It had one little short stick that tied on to the projectile, and that shorter stick, called a foreshaft, was set into the main shaft of the dart that projected through the air. But these are very common at our site. We found dozens of these projectile points. We also found them with knives, with grinding stones, with campfires, and it was at the Richard Beene Site, the best preserved time period was the time period about 7,000 years ago. And it's buried about 15 feet beneath the surface. And it was at a time period when floods were very common compared to other time periods. And so if I had lived at this site as a small person, as a child, and I had eaten my first deer, if I came back to that site as a grandparent, that the surface I walked on would already been buried by flood deposits, and I wouldn't be able to find any of the rocks that I knew as a child. And that process is how the Richard Beene Site became buried by more than 30 feet of flood deposits.
Okay.